Weather has always exercised a powerful and often decisive influence over the course of human endeavors and historical events. Throughout the long centuries of history, great ambitions have been laid low by the unpredictable forces of nature. For example, the attempted conquest of Japan by Kublai Khan was utterly shattered when his massive invasion fleet met its doom in the furious churn of a typhoon. Similarly, the immense army led by Napoleon perished during his disastrous campaign into Russia. This legendary fighting force was defeated not just by enemy action, but by the extreme conditions, enduring the terrible heat of summer and then the brutal, paralyzing cold of winter. Even at the famous Battle of Waterloo, the overwhelming defeat of Napoleon was partially influenced by the weather, as torrential rains transformed the crucial battlefield into a deep, impassable quagmire. However, the influence of atmospheric conditions became even more paramount during the 20th century, particularly with the arrival of highly advanced, mechanized warfare. New inventions, such as the airplane, the tank, and the modern sophisticated ship, meant that military operations were now acutely sensitive to meteorological factors. For instance, heavy bombers and other vital aircraft could easily be grounded completely by severe weather. Furthermore, their targets might become totally obscured by thick fog or dense cloud cover, rendering missions impossible or ineffective. Land offensives, which relied on the movement of heavy machinery, also required precise and reliable predictions of the weather. At sea, the massive convoys responsible for transporting absolutely vital supplies needed accurate forecasts to ensure the safe delivery of their precious cargo. During the global conflict known as the Second Great War, the gathering of this critical weather information swiftly evolved into an incredibly high-stakes contest, a relentless game of cat and mouse played out between the German forces and the Allies.
Understanding the importance of weather data. When the Second Great War officially began in 1939, the ability to forecast and predict weather was still reliant on traditional, time-honored instruments. The meteorologists of the 1940s did not possess the highly sophisticated devices available today, such as satellite imagery. Instead, they had to depend primarily on tools like the barometer. Despite these technological limitations, weathermen of that era were capable of generating fairly accurate predictions that extended up to 72 hours into the future. A key geographical reality defined the strategic struggle for weather superiority in Europe. European weather systems predominantly form far away in the remote Arctic regions of the Northern Hemisphere. These systems then typically drift across the continent in a west-to-east direction. This pattern meant that any nation positioned to the east needed data transmitted from locations further west, where the weather fronts began. When the war commenced, German forces immediately found themselves operating at a significant disadvantage when it came to both the collection and the interpretation of essential weather data. Germany simply did not possess any colonies or territories in the crucial Arctic region that could be utilized as permanent reporting stations. Prime weather reporting locations, such as the large island of Greenland, the smaller Jan Mayen Island, and the Svalbard archipelago, were geographically ideal. However, these territories were all owned by Denmark and Norway, nations that were officially neutral at the beginning of the conflict. In the initial months of the war, this established Scandinavian neutrality surprisingly offered some assistance to the German military. For example, the weather stations located on Greenland regularly transmitted their meteorological findings using a simple, unencrypted international code. The meteorologists stationed on Jan Mayen Island, belonging to Norway, followed the exact same practice. This crucial flow of open information changed fundamentally and immediately on April 9, 1940, the day that Adolf Hitler's forces invaded and occupied both Denmark and Norway. With their homelands now under enemy control, the remote island colonies were forced to make immediate decisions about how to proceed. The majority of Danes and Norwegians overseas chose resistance, even if passive, rather than accepting collaboration with the Nazis. Consequently, the German conquest of their countries meant that most Danish and Norwegian personnel working overseas began cooperating directly with the Allied powers, specifically the British and the Americans. This sudden shift cut off Germany's natural access to the vital Arctic data.
The German response and the dilemma of the U-boats. By the summer of 1940, the German leadership recognized they faced a serious strategic problem, a significant dilemma arising directly from their own success in Scandinavia. Although they had triumphed over the Scandinavian nations, this very victory had now jeopardized all their future operational planning. Appalled by the brutal and harsh subjugation of their countries, the Danish and Norwegian weathermen stationed overseas redirected their critical information exclusively to the Allies. Casting about desperately for a viable solution to this quickly worsening problem, the Germans turned their attention to the formidable submarine fleet commanded by Admiral Karl Dönitz. Dönitz's submarines, or U-boats, were assigned specific full-time duties as dedicated weather reporting stations from August 1940 through January 1941. Admiral Dönitz personally expressed deep annoyance with these tasks. He firmly believed that the job of gathering meteorological data, even though absolutely crucial, was fundamentally secondary to the U-boat fleet's primary mission: sinking enemy ships. Although the commitment of resources might have appeared small on paper, the requirements of crew turnover, transit times, and refitting meant that 6 different submarines were actually involved in this dedicated weather program. Dönitz had started the war with only 57 submarines in total, and only 27 of those were the long-range ocean-going Type 7 models. Original strategic planning had envisioned 300 U-boats patrolling the vast Atlantic Ocean, but the war had arrived too soon for these projections to become a reality. The admiral deeply disliked the concept of his precious few operational U-boats being utilized in such a seemingly routine, or as he called it, pedestrian manner. Much to Admiral Dönitz's relief, the U-boats finally concluded their dedicated full-time commitment to weather reporting in January 1941. Nevertheless, they continued to occasionally gather weather data while they were engaged in other primary missions. As time progressed, U-boats took on additional logistical roles, ferrying weather personnel to and from remote station sites, transporting essential equipment, and carrying necessary base supplies. The unmitigated disaster of the weather trawlers. Realizing the limitations of both submarines and aircraft, the German strategy shifted again. The Germans next decided to deploy specialized weather ships disguised as fishing trawlers into the dangerous waters of the North Atlantic. The hope was that these trawlers would be able to successfully evade Allied detection while simultaneously supplying the absolutely vital meteorological data the German forces desperately needed.
The result, however, was disastrous. The German weather trawler program was not merely a simple failure. The source material describes it as an unmitigated disaster. In fact, a powerful case can be made that this specific program became one of the major unintended contributors to the ultimate defeat of Germany. Unfortunately for the Nazis, the British naval forces were highly efficient at monitoring these weather ship transmissions, meaning the essential element of strategic surprise was immediately lost. One after another, the German weather trawlers were relentlessly pursued, captured, or sunk by the powerful ships of the British Royal Navy. The Royal Navy dedicated considerable time, effort, and material resources to capturing these weather ships, and the motive was not solely focused on stopping the transmission of meteorological data. The true value of these vessels lay in the fact that the weather trawlers carried the infamous Enigma cipher machines. These machines were highly secretive devices used for both transmitting and receiving messages in the German Enigma code. Every single captured weather trawler provided the British with crucial cryptographic items, such as rotors and related components. The seizure of these devices provided immense help to the British efforts to crack the highly complex Enigma code. Astonishingly, the Germans never completely grasped the fact that their weather missions were compromising the security of their top-secret Enigma communications. However, they eventually came to the definitive realization that the trawlers were far too vulnerable to consistent enemy action. It became increasingly evident that only fixed, land-based stations could provide the consistent, accurate weather data required to formulate genuinely useful predictions. The battles for Arctic strongholds. With the failure of the maritime efforts, the focus returned to securing land-based stations in the critical Arctic regions. In 1940, all possible sites for land-based weather stations were already securely in the hands of the Allies, or populations that were actively anti-Nazi. This situation made the entire German task significantly more difficult. However, there was one major factor working in the Germans' favor. These potential weather station sites were extremely remote and desolate areas. They were infamous for their natural hazards, extreme cold temperatures, and dangerous conditions, including the risk of attacks by polar bears. Given the intense isolation of these desolate regions, there remained a possibility that the Germans could establish bases that might successfully escape detection by Allied forces. Careful examination of the map showed that Jan Mayen Island, Spitsbergen, and Greenland represented the absolute best locations for gathering and transmitting essential weather data. All of these islands were situated squarely within the Arctic regions where European weather fronts originate. Furthermore, they were remote enough to give the Germans at least a glimmer of hope for successfully establishing a secret base. Adding to their value, existing weather stations were already in place on these islands.
The German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, understood that if they acted swiftly, they might be able to establish a functioning base before the British could implement effective countermeasures.
The contention for Jan Mayen Island. Jan Mayen Island is nothing more than a barren rock, measuring only 34 miles in length. Its most prominent geographical feature is the massive snow-covered Barenberg volcano, which rises to a height of 7,470 feet. The island, owned by Norway, lacks any natural resources but is geographically perfect for weather reporting. In 1940, Jan Mayen was populated only by 4 Norwegian meteorologists. These 4 men faithfully transmitted weather data back to their homeland. They were shocked and horrified when they heard news of the German invasion over their radio. Immediately upon hearing the news, the meteorologists ceased all transmissions directed toward Norway. They instead began sending their reports directly to the British. Recognizing their vulnerability, they also urgently requested assistance from the British, fearing that the Germans might attempt a physical occupation of the island. The British authorities responded with great speed. They dispatched the Free Norwegian gunboat Fridtjof Nansen, carrying a crew of 68 men, to help the meteorologists and to garrison the island against any potential German occupation. The Fridtjof Nansen arrived in October 1940, but its mission quickly turned to disaster when it ran aground on one of Jan Mayen's submerged reefs. The ship was declared a total loss, resulting in the temporary stranding of the 68 Norwegians who had come to support the weather station personnel. With the ship lost, winter was fast approaching, bringing with it violent storms and almost total darkness. Given these rapidly changing and dangerous circumstances, the decision was made to temporarily abandon Jan Mayen Island completely and leave it to the elements. The newly stranded garrison quickly radioed British authorities to report their situation and then settled down to await rescue. The food supply became an immediate problem for the stranded men. Fortunately, polar bears regularly prowled the area in their unending search for seals. The garrison was able to shoot 2 or 3 of these massive animals, which were then added to the men's dwindling larder. By the time the rescue ship finally appeared, the sea conditions were terrible, with rough, white-foamed water crashing violently against the island's jagged rocks. It required 10 separate trips to shuttle the stranded Norwegian personnel over the treacherous waters to the waiting rescue ship. The 4 original meteorologists were the very last personnel to abandon the island. Before their departure, they meticulously destroyed the radio equipment and eliminated anything else that the German forces might find valuable. The British intended to reoccupy Jan Mayen Island as soon as spring arrived. The failed German counter-mission. The Germans quickly noticed the unsettling silence coming from Jan Mayen. No radio traffic was being transmitted from the island. They dispatched reconnaissance aircraft from Norway, and the resulting flights confirmed that the island was indeed uninhabited. The German intelligence service, the Abwehr, immediately took a profound interest in this developing situation. Conventional wisdom suggested that no rational person would attempt an expedition to Jan Mayen so close to the onset of winter. However, the Germans calculated that if they acted with extreme speed, they might be able to land a team before the true severity of the bad weather and the deep winter darkness set in. It was a clear risk, but it was a calculated one that promised rich rewards in urgently needed weather data. A specialized weather troop was immediately formed, given the name Sonderkommando Graf Finkenstein, after its aristocratic leader, Ulrich Graf Count von Finkenstein. This expedition was a complex inter-service effort. It was, confusingly, characterized by overlapping duties and ambiguous authority, a structural complexity that was typical of the Nazi administration during this period. The teams were to be transported by the fishing trawler Hinrich Friese, captained by Lieutenant Wilhelm Krake and crewed by 13 civilian sailors. The Hinrich Friese set sail from Trondheim on November 12, 1940. In addition to the civilian crew, there were 3 distinct military units aboard. First, there was a 3-man Luftwaffe weather troop, led by Lieutenant Harold Brun. Next, there were 2 radio operators from the Abwehr, whose specific job was to transmit weather reports back to Europe. Finally, there was the Sonderkommando Graf Finkenstein party, which included Count von Finkenstein himself, the turncoat Dane Kurt Carlson, and 3 additional men. Unfortunately for the Germans, the British were leaving absolutely nothing to chance regarding Jan Mayen, which they had codenamed Island X.
The Royal Navy was determined to keep the island out of German hands at any cost, maintaining a close and continuous watch over the island and all its approaches. With the rough seas and the rapid approach of winter, these patrols were deeply tedious and often highly dangerous. However, the steadfast British perseverance was soon rewarded.
The Heinrich Fries successfully reached Jan Mayen on November 16, 1940, without incident, but the German ship's luck was about to run out. The British light cruiser HMS Naiad intercepted the German trawler before it could manage to land its weather team and vital equipment. The Heinrich Fries immediately attempted to flee, and the Naiad gave chase. There exist two differing versions of the events that followed. One account suggests that the German skipper attempted a desperate maneuver to guide his ship through the surrounding treacherous rocks, but failed. However, most accounts maintain that the Germans deliberately wrecked the vessel themselves, preferring its destruction to its imminent capture by the enemy. In either case, the Heinrich Fries violently smashed into the lava rocks, the massive impact sending a shudder through the vessel from stern to stem. The crew launched the lifeboats, but this process was complicated by great difficulty because the heavy surf continuously pushed the small boats violently against the side of the sinking German trawler. Huge, relentless waves soon engulfed the lifeboats, swamping them completely and forcing the freezing survivors into the bitterly cold sea. 2 men tragically drowned. The rest, exhausted, soaked, and freezing, managed to reach the shore only to be swiftly picked up by a British landing party. Allied reoccupation and air defense. The Allies made their return to Jan Mayen on March 10, 1941, when the Free Norwegian ship Vesla Kari arrived carrying 12 Norwegian meteorologists. As more time passed, a small military garrison was established, adding to the island's population. This garrison brought with them several anti-aircraft guns. These defenses were quickly proven necessary because the Germans soon commenced conducting air raids against the newly established weather station. Jan Mayen Island is situated only about 600 miles to the west of Norway, placing it comfortably within the operational reach of long-range German bombers. 4-engine Focke-Wulf Fur W200 Condor bombers visited the island frequently for a period of time, though they ultimately inflicted little significant damage. These missions were far from easy for the Luftwaffe air crews. The weather conditions could rapidly turn terrible, and the presence of Allied anti-aircraft guns posed a constant danger. On August 7, 1941, one Focke-Wulf 200, flying in heavy fog, crashed violently onto one of the island's mountainsides. All 9 crew members perished in the crash. Pieces of the wreckage of this plane remain scattered on the mountainside to this very day. In 1950, the wreckage of yet another German plane was found on the southwest side of the island. By the close of 1941, the Germans had completely abandoned any serious idea of seizing and holding the island, although sporadic nuisance bombing raids continued occasionally. Spitsbergen, coal, weather, and naval might. Spitsbergen, a much larger island, also became an area of intense interest for the Germans in their persistent quest to establish reliable weather stations. Spitsbergen measures some 280 miles long and varies in width from 25 to 140 miles. It is a component of the Svalbard archipelago and is owned by Norway. Spitsbergen assumed an even greater strategic importance after Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. Beyond its excellent location for gathering crucial weather data, Spitsbergen possessed valuable deposits of coal. Some of the island's coal mines were operated by Norwegian companies, while others were under the control of the Russians. Although preliminary investigations had ruled out Spitsbergen as a suitable Allied naval base due to the serious hazards posed by seasonal ice, its weather and material resources remained critical. British Prime Minister Churchill personally championed a plan that demanded bold and decisive action regarding Spitsbergen. The proposal called for the complete evacuation of the island's entire population. The Russians living there would be repatriated back to the Soviet Union, and the Norwegians would be transported safely to Britain. Both the government in Moscow and the Norwegian government operating in exile readily agreed to this strategic scheme.
The mission, which received the codename Operation Gauntlet, sailed on August 19, 1941, and arrived just a few days later. The British effort included Canadian troops and the Royal Navy's Force K, commanded by Rear Admiral Philip Vine. The troops were carried aboard the ocean liner Empress of Canada. The escort for the liner included Admiral Vine's flagship, the cruiser HMS Nigeria, the cruiser HMS Aurora, 3 destroyers, and several smaller support ships. At the time the mission sailed, the Allies did not know if the German forces had already occupied the island. They had not. The local Norwegian and Russian inhabitants proved to be more than cooperative with the Allied forces. The miners were safely evacuated, and demolition teams spread out across the island to methodically destroy the mines and any excess fuel stocks. While the demolition work was continuing, the island's radio stations maintained their broadcasts, acting as if everything was normal. They even transmitted false weather reports, deliberately sending news of heavy fog in an attempt to deter potential German reconnaissance aircraft. The radio stations were only destroyed once the evacuation and demolition mission was fully completed. In total, a substantial number of people were evacuated from Spitsbergen. No fewer than 1,955 Russians and 765 Norwegians were safely removed. Operation Gauntlet was a significant success. However, just as had occurred on Jan Mayen Island, the Germans swiftly attempted to exploit the power vacuum created by the Allied withdrawal. It took the Germans only a few days to understand what had happened, and once they realized the island was empty, they moved very quickly. A small 10-man Luftwaffe meteorological team was landed on the northeast corner of Spitsbergen. They then carved a crude landing strip out of the island's desolate soil, establishing German weather bases on Spitsbergen. Throughout the entire month of October 1941, the German Luftwaffe shuttled in nearly 4 tons of necessary supplies to the newly established foothold. By November 11th, several German weather stations were fully operational and transmitting data. Station Bonzo successfully passed the winter of 1941 and 1942, operating in Advendalen, which is located near the settlement of Longyearbyen. Simultaneously, Station Knosp was transmitting data from its location near Krossfjord. The Allies were absolutely not willing to allow the Nazis to seize control of the strategically vital island without a subsequent fight. It was certainly frustrating, but the Allied forces were compelled to wait until the harsh Arctic winter had passed. Consequently, the German weather stations were left unmolested and operating freely for a period of 6 months. In May 1942, 2 ships, the Isbjorn and the Celis, arrived at Spitsbergen. They were carrying approximately 80 Free Norwegian ski troops, whose mission was to successfully root out the German forces and re-establish firm Allied control over the island. The ships successfully sailed up the Gronfjord, or Greenfjord, and anchored to begin unloading supplies. On the night of May 14th, they came under immediate attack by Focke-Wulf FW-200 aircraft and were badly damaged. One of the ships was sunk outright, and the other was set ablaze. 14 Norwegian soldiers were killed during this air raid. The remaining men successfully abandoned the burning and sinking ships, plunging into the sub-freezing water. They managed to clamber on to nearby ice floes and eventually reached the shore. According to an account published in Time magazine at the time, the troops made it to the settlement of Barentsbruck, but their expedition was an utter shambles. Their essential radio equipment was destroyed and gone. They were heavily burdened by their wounded comrades, and had only managed to salvage 15 skis, a few rifles, and a single broken lamp. Luckily, they were able to attract the attention of a consolidated PBY Catalina flight boat from the British Coastal Command. They achieved this feat by using their salvaged broken lamp as a signaling device. Their desperate message was successfully received, and on June 2nd, the British arrived bringing much-needed reinforcements and supplies. The Norwegian ski troops then began scouring the massive island in search of the elusive German stations. According to one military report, there was a brief skirmish during which 1 German soldier was killed. For the most part, however, the German weather stations simply shut down their operations and completely melted away. The various German weather teams were subsequently evacuated from the island by U-boat submarine.
Even though the organized German presence had been successfully removed from Spitsbergen, they left behind a sophisticated automated weather station. This automated station successfully transmitted meteorological data throughout the entire summer of 1942. By this time, Free Norwegian troops had established complete and secure control over Spitsbergen. The Allied island defenses included machine guns and several 3-inch artillery pieces. Operation Zetrona, the last great naval attack. The Germans exhibited stubborn refusal to fully abandon the strategic importance of Spitsbergen. By late 1942 and early 1943, the tide of the war was undeniably turning against them. However, in October 1942, the Kriegsmarine successfully landed a small, 6-man team in the north at Krossfjord. They codenamed this new base Station Nussbaum. Significantly, the Norwegians were never able to locate or neutralize this will-o-wisp station. In the late summer of 1943, Adolf Hitler made the startling decision to mount a major raid against Spitsbergen. Militarily, the operation appeared to make very little strategic sense. North Africa had been lost, and the major German summer offensive at Kursk had ended in failure. Frustrated and seeking psychological relief from these major defeats, Hitler perhaps sought solace in the promise of a cheap and easy victory. In any case, the raid on Spitsbergen, which was codenamed Zitrona, or Sicilian, was an overwhelming display of naval power, described as overkill from its very inception. Operation Zitrona included some of the most powerful surface vessels in the entire German fleet. The armada included the mighty battleship Tirpitz, the powerful cruiser Scharnhorst, and 9 accompanying destroyers. A full battalion of German soldiers was also included to serve as the landing party. The small Free Norwegian garrison on the island, consisting of only about 100 men, could hardly be expected to withstand such an immense armada. The German fleet arrived at Spitsbergen on September 6, successfully taking the small Norwegian forces by complete surprise. The Tirpitz trained its massive 15-inch guns on the settlements of Longyearbyen and Barentsburg, setting fire to the towns and killing some of the garrison personnel. The Scharnhorst and the other German ships added their own considerable firepower to the destructive barrage. The small Norwegian 3-inch guns were quickly suppressed. This allowed the waiting German troops to easily come ashore. The Norwegian defenders fought bravely but were quickly overwhelmed by the superior force. 9 Norwegian soldiers were killed and 41 were taken as prisoners. However, many of the garrison managed to escape into the vast interior of the island and were never captured. Operation Zitrona achieved a tragic place in history as the first and also the last time the colossal Tirpitz battleship ever fired its formidable guns in anger. The German fire coordination during the assault proved poor, however. At one point, the mighty Tirpitz was actually observed lobbing its massive 15-inch shells directly toward its own landing troops. Once the German forces secured the island, they systematically set about destroying all Allied facilities, including the absolutely vital weather station. Despite their overwhelming military might, the German fleet was compelled to withdraw after only a few days. Their position was determined to be simply too exposed and fundamentally untenable. After the German forces withdrew, the Allies returned, rebuilt all the damaged facilities, and successfully reoccupied the island. The Nazis would never again return to Spitsbergen in such overwhelming force, but the complex game of cat and mouse involving the landing and subsequent withdrawing of secretive weather teams continued. Greenland and the smallest army. Greenland holds the distinction of being the largest island in the world, encompassing a massive 827,000 square miles. Approximately 80% of this immense landmass is perpetually buried under thick, deep glaciers. Only the southwestern coast is considered relatively congenial to human civilization. In 1940, the total population was sparse, numbering only around 20,000 souls. This population primarily consisted of native Eskimo people, along with some Danes and a scattering of Norwegians. Greenland was a Danish colony, governed by a small number of Danish civil servants.
In 1940, this vast expanse of majestic mountains, enormous glaciers, and long fjords was administered by a Dane named Eske Brun. After the German invasion of his homeland, he correctly assumed that Denmark would fall under Hitler's control and would be forced to comply with Nazi wishes and directives. Brun could still maintain communications with Copenhagen, but he realized he could not fully trust any directives that might be sent from home. He concluded that his only remaining option was to declare Greenland an independent nation for the duration of the war. Governor Brun was particularly concerned about Greenland's entire east coast, a truly desolate wilderness stretching for 1,600 miles. He feared that the Germans might attempt to establish secretive weather stations or even actual military bases in this remote area, and he knew he would be helpless to stop them without outside aid. He immediately consulted with the Americans. At the time, the United States was still officially neutral, but it was abundantly clear that the Americans did not want any German foothold established in North America. The American advisors recommended that virtually the entire sparse population of eastern Greenland be evacuated and relocated to the south. The rationale was that this strategy would make it much easier to spot any intruders who might attempt to land. Governor Brun agreed to the plan. However, he still had to address the crucial question: if the Germans did arrive, who would successfully detect their presence in the vast wilderness? Brunn's solution was the formation of the Northeast Greenland Sledge Patrol. This small, dedicated group was composed of a handful of Eskimos, Danes, and Norwegians, whose sole purpose was to keep the vast coastline under strict, constant surveillance. The sledge patrollers, numbering around 15 men in total, established their headquarters in the isolated village of Eskimnes. Before the war began, most of these men had worked as solitary trappers or hunters, meaning they were intimately and thoroughly familiar with the icy wilderness. As their name implies, their patrols were conducted by sledge, pulled by dog teams. Their operational range extended from 70 to 77 degrees north latitude, covering a stretch of coastline approximately 500 miles long. Even prior to the formal formation of the sledge patrol, the United States had begun to take a keen and active interest in the fate of Greenland. Dr. Henrik de Kaufmann, the Danish ambassador to the United States, met with President Franklin Roosevelt on the day immediately following the German invasion of Denmark. President Roosevelt immediately welcomed Kaufmann and formally invoked the long-standing Monroe Doctrine. Although the United States remained neutral at the time, President Roosevelt affirmed that the nation would not tolerate the presence of any outside foreign power in North America. As time progressed, Greenland became a formal protectorate of the United States for the duration of the global conflict. But the question of a German move remained. The answer arrived in the fall of 1940. The Norwegian supply ship Veslakari, which was carrying Danish and Norwegian hunters, along with 50 armed pro-German collaborationists, was captured by the Free Norwegian warship Fridtjof Nansen. The original objective of the Veslakari mission had been to seize the weather station located at Mugbukta and begin sending meteorological reports to the Luftwaffe. This plan would likely have succeeded had it not been for the timely intervention of the Fridtjof Nansen. The Coast Guard patrol and the first capture. In June and July 1941, the United States Greenland Patrol was formally organized. The organization was placed under the direction of Admiral Harold Stark, who was the Chief of Naval Operations. The primary orders given to the Greenland Patrol were to support the efforts of the United States Army in constructing air bases on Greenland. However, the paramount directive was to defend Greenland and specifically prevent German operations in northeast Greenland. The patrol was commanded by Commander Edward Iceberg Smith, a figure who was something of a legend within the United States Coast Guard. Commander Smith was a seasoned veteran of Arctic conditions. He commented that his mission encompassed a little bit of everything, but noted that the Coast Guard was accustomed to such wide-ranging duties.
In September 1941, the Sledge Patrol sent back a crucial report. Strangers had been sighted near the entrance of Franz Josef Fjord. Now operating on full alert, the United States Coast Guard cutter Northland discovered a Norwegian fishing trawler named Busko, located approximately 300 miles south of the initial sightings. The crew members of the Busko were intensively questioned and finally admitted that they had landed a party of men equipped with a radio transmitter. Following a diligent search of the area, the Northland dispatched a 12-man shore party led by Lieutenant Leroy McCluskey. Their task was to investigate a highly suspicious hunter's shack. With their rifles held at the ready, the shore party cautiously surrounded the shack to ensure that none of the occupants could escape. Once his men were firmly in position, Lieutenant McCluskey kicked open the door and rushed inside, his gun drawn. Inside the shack were 3 startled Germans. They immediately offered no resistance. The hut contained sophisticated radio equipment. The Germans, however, seemed almost relieved to be captured. They offered Lieutenant McCluskey a cup of coffee and quickly started a fire to heat it. The sharp-eyed lieutenant immediately realized that this was a ruse, a desperate attempt to burn their essential code book before the Americans could seize it. McCluskey successfully rescued the crucial book just in time. The capture of the Busko is frequently cited as the first American naval capture of the Second Great War. Technically, this claim is inaccurate because the United States was still officially neutral at the time, and the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor was still about 3 months in the future. In reality, the Germans and their Norwegian cohorts were taken into custody not as formal prisoners of war, but instead as illegal immigrants. Combat and the smallest army. The Germans attempted their most daring and, for a period, their most successful foray into Greenland in 1943. In August of that year, the German trawler Saken sailed carrying a weather team destined for Sabine Island, located on Hansa Bay. This position was near Greenland's coast and only about 70 miles away from the established sledge patrol base at Eskimnes.
The expedition, codenamed Holzaug, was led by Lieutenant Hermann Ritter. Ritter was an Austrian who was reportedly not a Nazi and was said to have little enthusiasm for the dangerous mission. Ritter was also reportedly uncomfortable with the fact that the sledge patrol headquarters was so close, at least by the vast standards of the Greenland wilderness. The German weather party successfully established their station and immediately prepared to endure the harsh winter. In the spring, sledge patroller Marius Jensen, accompanied by 2 Eskimos, approached Sabine Island. They were greatly surprised to discover distinct tracks in the snow. These tracks indicated that men wearing heeled boots had recently passed through the area. These men had to be strangers. A short time later, Jensen and his companions spotted a small hut that appeared to be inhabited. Its occupants had just fled and could still be seen as tiny moving specks in the distance. When Jensen entered the abandoned hut, his eyes were immediately drawn to a jacket. It bore swastika insignia. The Germans had landed and established a presence. Jensen managed to successfully return to Eskimo Ness and raise the urgent alarm. It occurred to Governor Brunn that the sledge patrollers were technically civilians. If they were to get involved in a firefight with the German soldiers and subsequently captured, they risked execution by the Nazis as partisans or bandits. To grant them legal combatant status, Brunn officially and formally created the Greenland Army. Its leader, Ib Paulsen, was made a captain, and the others received various military ranks. Thus, these approximately 15 men became the official smallest army of the Second Great War. However, the men had little time to enjoy their newly found military status. The Germans swiftly launched a surprise raid against Eskimo Ness and completely burned the base to the ground. The few patrollers who were present at the time managed to escape, but the destruction of their headquarters represented a definite Allied setback. On the return journey back to their Sabine Island base, the Germans encountered sledge patroller Eli Knudsen and brutally machine-gunned him to death, despite the fact that Lieutenant Ritter had wanted him taken alive. Later, 2 more sledge patrollers were successfully captured. One of the prisoners, Marius Jensen, managed to find Lieutenant Ritter alone. Jensen turned the tables on the German officer, capturing him and forcing him to march 300 miles south to American custody.
In the meantime, American bombers successfully located the Sabine Island weather station and reduced the entire site to rubble. The trawler Sachin was also destroyed in the same bombing raid. The crew of the Sachin and its weather team abandoned the wrecked weather station. They hid successfully until they were evacuated by a flying boat approximately 1 month later. One team member, named Rudolf Sensei, was accidentally left behind. He was subsequently taken prisoner by a shore patrol from the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Northland. It is also noted that a Dr. Rolf Sensei was left behind by other members of a German weather information gathering party on Sabine Island and later captured. The final German units. By 1944, the inescapable tide of the war had decisively turned against Germany. Its valuable resources were rapidly dwindling. Yet weather reporting remained so absolutely vital that the Nazis continued to dispatch furtive, secretive expeditions into the Arctic regions. In July, the ever-present Northland located and successfully destroyed a German weather station located at Cape Sussy. Later, the Northland discovered the German trawler Coburg trapped immovably in the ice and gutted completely by fire. Clutching at every last straw in a desperate attempt to stave off inevitable defeat, the Germans planned 3 additional weather stations in the Arctic. The first expedition, led by a Lieutenant Weiss, was given the romantic code name Edelweiss. The second expedition, under the leadership of Lieutenant and Doctor of Philosophy Carl Schmid, was labeled Goldschmid. A third effort, codenamed Hautigen, was dispatched by the submarine U-307 towards Spitzbergen. The weather expedition Edelweiss was aboard the trawler Keatingen when it was intercepted by the ubiquitous cutter Northland. Following a prolonged 7.5-hour chase, the German trawler became stuck fast in the ice and was scuttled by its own crew. Its officers and crew were then taken into custody. The United States Coast Guard now possessed newer and far more powerful weapons and ships at its disposal, including a new class of specialized ice-breaking cutter. The USS Eastwind was one of these formidable vessels. It was dispatched to respond to a report of suspicious activity on Greenland's Little Coldway Island. A specially trained landing force, unique in the history of the Coast Guard, was aboard. This force quickly went ashore to investigate the suspicious activity. The Americans successfully surprised and captured the entire 12-man Goldschmid weather party without firing a single shot. The Eastwind followed up this notable success by locating and capturing the very ship that had originally landed the Goldschmid team. The German trawler Externstein surrendered only after the Eastwind fired some warning shots.
The Externstein holds the distinction of being the only German surface vessel successfully captured at sea by United States forces during the entire Second Great War. Weather Station Houtigen, consisting of a cluster of small huts, was considered lavish by the Spartan standards of the Arctic. The facilities included a 7-bunk dormitory and a small library containing 20 volumes. The German personnel, a mixture of skilled technicians and soldiers, received news of Germany's official surrender over their radio on May 7, 1945. For the next several months, a strange interlude occurred. The Germans continued to broadcast essential weather data, but they did so in plain transmissions without using any code. They finally and formally surrendered to the captain of a Norwegian hunting vessel in September 1945. They were the last German unit to formally capitulate in the Second Great War. The curious postscript of Weather Station Kurt. The Strategic Weather War had a curious and little-known Canadian postscript that unfolded 4 decades following the official German surrender. The story began on October 22, 1943, when the German submarine U-537 successfully arrived at Martin Bay in northern Labrador. A meteorologist named Dr. Kurt Sommermeyer and his assistant were aboard the submarine. Their primary mission was to quietly set up an automated weather station. Every effort was undertaken to ensure the secrecy of the installation. Since there was always a possibility that Allied forces might discover the site, every possible measure was taken to deliberately throw such visitors off the true track. The station was misleadingly marked with the legend Canadian Weather Service. Furthermore, the ground surrounding the installation was strategically littered with discarded American cigarette butts. Dr. Sommermeyer carefully ensured that the station was functioning properly before the Germans departed for Europe. Unfortunately, the Wetterfunkgerät, or WFL number 26, which was also known as Weather Station Kurt, was only operational for a total of a few days. Kurt abruptly stopped transmitting, possibly due to failing batteries or some other technical problem.
Weather Station Kurt was completely forgotten until the 1980s. Dr. Sommermeyer had passed away by this time. However, his personal papers remained intact, providing a dedicated researcher with crucial clues regarding the station's actual whereabouts. The station was successfully relocated in 1981. It was found complete with all its canisters, its tripod, the transmission mast, and the dry cell batteries. Today, Weather Station Kurt is proudly displayed at the Canadian War Museum. It stands as a tangible and unique reminder of a truly fascinating episode in the complex history of the Second Great War. Insights and implications of the Weather War. The struggle for control over meteorological information during the Second Great War was a complex, relentless, and often brutal subplot that profoundly influenced the larger conflict. The constant effort to gather accurate data highlights the extreme lengths to which both the Allies and the German forces were willing to go to gain a marginal yet critical strategic advantage. The geographical realities of the Arctic, where European weather systems are formed before drifting west to east, placed Germany at an immediate and serious disadvantage. This disadvantage was amplified by the shift in allegiance of crucial reporting stations in Norway and Denmark following the 1940 invasions. The ensuing German attempts to compensate through U-boats, air patrols, and the ill-fated trawler fleet demonstrate the desperation and necessity for this data. One of the most profound and unintended consequences of the Weather War was the failure of the German weather trawler program. The British Royal Navy's relentless pursuit and subsequent capture of these seemingly mundane vessels were not merely about stopping weather reports. Each captured trawler yielded vital cryptographic items, components such as rotors, which directly assisted the British effort to crack the highly sophisticated German Enigma code. This accidental compromise proved to be a catastrophic vulnerability for the Nazis. The German High Command never fully understood the true extent to which their weather missions were jeopardizing the security of their most secret communications. The failure of the trawler program forced a retreat to the only reliable alternative, the establishment of remote, land-based stations. The resulting battle for the Arctic islands, Jan Mayen, Spitsbergen, and Greenland, showcased the extreme operational environment and the sheer difficulty of maintaining a presence in such desolate regions. On Jan Mayen, the British and Free Norwegian forces repeatedly thwarted German attempts, culminating in the loss of the Hinrichsfries and the capture of the Sonderkommando Grafeinkenstein team. Spitsbergen saw back-and-forth action, involving massive Allied evacuations like Operation Gauntlet, successful German establishment of bases like Station Bonso and Knospa, and fierce fighting involving Norwegian ski troops. The sheer strategic importance of Spitsbergen was underscored by Hitler's decision to commit some of his navy's most powerful surface vessels, including the battleship Tirpitz, to the destructive Operation Citronanella raid in 1943. Despite the overwhelming show of force, the German fleet's presence proved unsustainable. The continuous cat-and-mouse struggle involved German teams being landed by submarine, only to be forced to melt away and be evacuated when Allied pressure mounted. The Greenland campaign offered unique insights into the logistical challenges of this conflict. Governor Eske Brun's establishment of the Northeast Greenland Sledge Patrol, ultimately formalized as the war's smallest army, underlines the intense dedication of the local population to resist German intrusion. The early capture of the Busko and its crew, taken in as illegal immigrants by the neutral United States, marked a crucial early victory for the American forces in their role as Greenland's protector. Later conflicts, such as the fight against the German Holzauge expedition on Sabine Island, demonstrated the intense personal danger faced by the patrollers, including the murder of Eli Knudsen. Despite the overwhelming shift in the war's overall momentum against Germany by 1944, the commitment to gathering weather data never ceased. Expeditions like Edelweiss, Goldschmidt, and Haudegen were planned and executed, demonstrating that reliable forecasting remained a non-negotiable military requirement until the final moments of the war. The capture of the Goldschmidt team by the United States Coast Guard cutter Eastwind without a shot being fired, and the subsequent capture of the trawler Externstein marked tangible success in the Allied suppression efforts. The trawler Externstein holds a unique place as the only German surface vessel captured by United States forces during the entire war. The tenacity of the German effort is best captured by the final fate of weather station Haudegen on Spitsbergen. Hearing the news of Germany's capitulation in May 1945, the technicians and soldiers of the station continued their meteorological work, switching only to plain, unencrypted radio transmissions. Their formal surrender in September 1945 to a Norwegian hunting vessel marks them as the very last German unit to officially capitulate in the Second Great War.
The subsequent discovery of Weather Station Kurt in Labrador decades later further reinforces the scope and secrecy of the German efforts. This automated station, designed to provide data from the crucial North American weather source, was meticulously disguised to deceive Allied forces. Though it failed quickly, its existence proves that the German quest for meteorological dominance extended across the entirety of the North Atlantic region. The enduring significance of Arctic intelligence. The story of the Weather War illuminates how military operations, even those involving massive naval fleets and mechanized armies, are ultimately governed by the most fundamental natural forces. The high-stakes game played out across the desolate, icy landscapes of the Arctic was an intelligence campaign waged with submarines, disguised trawlers, bomber aircraft, ski troops, and even dog sleds. The determination of the German forces to gain access to the data originating in the Arctic regions, a key geographical factor in European weather prediction, was relentless. Their persistent efforts were driven by the understanding that accurate weather forecasting was essential, from everything from routing supply convoys at sea to launching major air and land offensives. Conversely, the Allied success in denying Germany this access, either through diplomatic alignment, strategic evacuation, or brute force, was a quiet but significant victory. Perhaps the most enduring takeaway from this hidden theater of conflict is the unintentional linkage between meteorology and cryptology. The German weather trawler program, intended to secure a strategic advantage, instead became a source of cryptographic keys that helped unlock the Enigma code. This failure was a major contributor to the overall German defeat, demonstrating that in modern, complex warfare, a weakness in one highly specialized area, such as weather reconnaissance, can cascade into a fatal vulnerability in intelligence and operational security across the entire conflict. The weather war was not fought with grand battleships or massive infantry charges, but with dedication and isolation, freezing desperation, and ingenuity in the face of nature's extremes. It was a fight defined by frozen landscapes, the isolation of remote islands like Jan Mayen, and the courage of small groups of men such as the Northeast Greenland Sledge Patrol. Their story serves as a powerful reminder that even in a conflict dominated by powerful technology, the most elemental forces of the natural world retain the power to define history. The quest for control over the weather was a hidden struggle that proved critical, shaping the outcome of the Second Great War one forecast at a time. The physical remnants of this strange conflict, like the wreckage on Jan Mayen and Weather Station Kurt in Labrador, stand as mute testimony to the severity and significance of this largely forgotten war for meteorological dominance.